what I think is interesting about the Zelensky message is he was kind of winding up Vladimir Putin in a very important way. And that is, as well as saying I'm younger and probably better looking than President Putin, he was saying, I'm not going away. That's the message. Because we know that the Kremlin wants to get rid of the Zelensky government. We know that it will spread all the propaganda about the government being illegitimate, that there'll be Nazis, that they will continue to push disinformation. They'll try to maneuver the Americans where it's not just a question of Ukraine giving up territory, but that it has to give up its government as well. And Zelensky's saying, no, it's not going to happen. And, Zelensky has said recently, look, as soon as we get a ceasefire, a reliable ceasefire, which is monitored, then we can have elections. And I think those will be very competitive elections. Indeed, I've just noted the interview that General Zelensky, who is likely to be a candidate in those elections, is given to the Associated Press. But until you get a ceasefire, no, you cannot hold those elections, and you cannot expect the Zelensky government just to say, oh, we're going to go on vacation. So it was kind of a bit of theater, but it was kind of necessary theater from Zelensky just to say, look, Kremlin, go ahead and give it this, shout all you want, but we still resist.
Joining us today, Scott Lucas, Professor of International Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome back to our program, Professor Lucas, and let's begin our conversation with most recent negotiations in Switzerland. Two sources told Axios that these negotiations got stuck. What is your reaction to this? And according to Axios, negotiations stuck due to Vladimir Medinsky position during these talks.
So we've had 2 days of talks, Tuesday and Wednesday in Geneva, the third set of talks between Ukraine, Russia, United States mediators. But I think the most interesting report is not from unnamed sources. I think it's from President Vladimir Zelensky, because Zelensky spoke not just about a political group in the discussions. He spoke about a military group in the discussions. And what I found interesting is he talked about progress amongst the military group. Now, by that, I think he actually refers to the idea, which is, look, they were discussing how you monitor a ceasefire. And of course, we know that a ceasefire along the current front lines is essential in trying to end Russia's full-scale invasion. Zelensky's message indicated that there seems to be a working agreement that the U.S. will lead the monitoring mission. So the Americans will be involved in monitoring the ceasefire, but there is still the issue about whether Europeans will be involved in the mission to oversee the ceasefire, presumably because the Russians object to that. And the Russians have said quite clearly they do not want any European troops inside Ukraine. But at least we were getting progress technically in terms of what a ceasefire might look like. But that brings us to the political group, because you've got to get to a ceasefire. And there you quoted the unnamed officials who said that the discussions were stuck. But Zelensky also indicated that there had been very little progress on the political front. He did not name the Kremlin's chief negotiator, Mr. Medinsky. But what he said, I think, was even more interesting and more important, using a couple of rude words, because even though he is posting this on social media, you can tell he is frustrated. Zelensky said, we don't need any more historical lessons from the Russians. And we know that Vladimir Putin and we know his officials like to go on long-winded historical explanations about how Ukraine is part of a greater Russia. It appears that Medinsky, instead of negotiating on the serious issues, such as the status of the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine, such as the security guarantees for the rest of Ukraine, such as the fate of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, instead of actually negotiating on these issues, Medinsky simply went off on polemic effectively restating the Kremlin's maximum demands. Politically, Ukraine should surrender to Russia. For that reason, whereas the talks were 6 hours or almost 6 hours on Tuesday, they were only 2 hours yesterday, and they ended earlier than we expected. Another sign that we really didn't get that much progress. Ukraine is saying we still would like to have a third round of meetings in February. Another round of meetings in February. We wait to see what the Kremlin says, but I think at least my expectations are being fulfilled. And that is, you can discuss the military arrangements for a ceasefire, but until the Kremlin gives up its maximum demands, and by that I mean seizing all of the Donetsk region, keeping the rest of Ukraine weak with no effective security guarantees, until the Kremlin thinks it can get those, we will not get progress in these negotiations, because the Russians do not come to the table to negotiate. They come to the table to get Ukraine to surrender.
You just mentioned about President Zelensky's statement. Also, President Zelensky told Axios that Ukrainians would reject any deal requiring them to give up the Donbass region to Russia. You also have pointed out and mentioned about some kind of technical progress in this military group, but how can we make any kind of progress without solving major issues and major divisions between both sides?
You can't. I mean, there's still a value to the talks on the military side, because, if we suddenly got a breakthrough, then the military arrangements are in place. You don't have to go through and discuss them after you suddenly get a ceasefire. So those talks are still valuable. But, politically, there's no movement here. There hasn't been movement politically with the Kremlin throughout any of these talks. Just as in, the much vaunted talks in Istanbul back in 2022, in the spring of 22, that those talks fell apart because the Russians at the end of the day gave Ukraine another ultimatum. They changed the terms. So I think what was interesting about Zelensky's comments were not just saying that we can't give up Donbass without a referendum, which is true. I think it was also the comments that he made on Tuesday, which said, okay, we can't give up Donbass without a referendum. We're not going to give up the Donbass without a referendum. We're not going to give up Donetsk without a referendum, but we will withdraw. So we'll pull back our military forces in Donetsk, the 22% we control, provided the Russians withdraw from the occupied areas of Donetsk. In other words, here's Zelensky saying, look, we will establish a demilitarized zone. And the Americans quite often talk about a demilitarized free economic zone. Zelensky's saying, okay, we will do that. We will demilitarize here if the Russians do as well. But there is no indication from the Kremlin that they will accept that demilitarized zone. I just restate this. It's, for all the discussions on peace talks, what could happen, what the terms could be, if the Kremlin wants all of the Donetsk region, which is very strategic, and the Kremlin is not going to give up the demand for all of the Donetsk region, there will not be an agreement, because Ukraine is not going to give up that fortified area. Its European partners are not going to accept giving up that fortified area. And Russia is not going to accept having only what it occupies right now.
There is a interesting shift in Kremlin, because the source close to the Kremlin said to Western media that Russian officials like Steve Witkoff energy and positive tone there sometimes question how reliable he was, and he was not too new to the core US-Russia issues, and initially brought no other American experts into talks, and more recently they welcomed Jared Kushner, citing his more structured and organized approach. So I'm really curious, how significant is this shift in Moscow perception, and why is it happening now?
Oh, why are they having it now? Because they think that Witkoff is not the route to get the Americans to support their position. They think that they can flatter Jared Kushner and offer him economic deals, and that will be the key to the U.S. siding with the Kremlin on its maximum demands, including over Donetsk. Let's rewind this a bit. The Kremlin had no problem with Steve Witkoff showing up with no other American officials when he met Vladimir Putin last spring in the Kremlin. They were quite happy he didn't show up with any other American officials because they could try to manipulate him. They were very happy last October when they sent Kirill Dmitriev, Vladimir Putin's top economic advisor, to Florida to work with Witkoff on this ultimatum to Ukraine, this 28-point ultimatum. But between late October and today, the Kremlin could not get the Trump administration to fully back its demands for Ukraine's surrender. And so what happened? A couple weeks ago, in between the various sets of talks that we had, first in Abu Dhabi, then in Geneva, the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, got upset with the Americans, and he lashed out at the Americans. And he said, the Americans are retreating from the agreement which we had with them at the summit last August. The meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Well, there was no U.S.-Russian agreement at Alaska last August. The Americans did not agree to the Russian demands. What the Russians had asked for at Alaska, however, was all of Donetsk. That's what they'd asked for. And they still hadn't gotten it. So it's like, okay, they don't respect Witkoff. Let's be honest here. They chose Witkoff based on psychological profiles because they thought they could manipulate a real estate developer. But when Witkoff couldn't deliver for them, who do they go to? They go to the next person they think can deliver for them. And when the Russians are talking about trillions of dollars in economic projects, and when Jared Kushner has an investment firm where he's hoping to get billions of dollars of contracts, as he has done from Gulf states in the Middle East, when you have a Trump family which is trying to get billions of dollars of deals from all around the world, as we found out just yesterday through Eric and Donald Trump Jr., then the Kremlin thinks, Steve Witkoff, real estate developer, not that important. Jared Kushner would like to have billions of dollars behind his investment firm. He can be important.
Actually continue this logic of Russia is wanting to take all of Donbass and even maybe to catch up more territories. I would like also to quote European intelligence because according to them, European intelligence chiefs are pessimistic about a ceasefire this year, despite, as we know, Donald Trump saying talks have brought a progress. And senior officials, as Reuters quote them, believe that Russia does not want a quick end and using the U.S. Ukrainian-Russian talks to seek sanctions relief and to achieve new business deals with Americans. And one official called the latest Geneva talks, I quote, a theater, noting Russia's economy is not near collapse. And is actually Trump aware of the risk that Russia is just buying time and playing a game, or as officials called it, theater? And would tougher sanctions actually significantly damage Russia's economy if it's still actually able to produce something?
Donald Trump does not think logically about Ukraine and Russia. Donald Trump doesn't have enough information to think about Ukraine and Russia. Donald Trump thinks emotionally about Ukraine and Russia. And throughout this week, before and during the Geneva talks, Donald Trump emotionally was saying, Ukraine better make a deal. Ukraine better make a deal or else. Why is it Ukraine that should make a deal? Why isn't it the Kremlin that should make a deal? Especially when the Kremlin, hours before the Geneva talks, launched 29 missiles and almost 400 drones on Ukrainian civilian areas, including energy infrastructure. Why should it be Ukraine that should make a deal? That's just Donald Trump talking off the top of his head. And as we have discussed many times before, who are the other American officials who are involved here? Do they believe that Ukraine should surrender, or are they willing to accept that Ukraine's security is important? And that's where we are. But the broader point here from the European intelligence reports are the Kremlin is not going to compromise. We know that. So your open question, Sofia, is how long can the Kremlin maintain a full-scale assault in the air and on the ground? And what the Europeans are saying quite rightly is this continues for the foreseeable future. Vladimir Putin's not going to suddenly say, okay, I stop now. We'll hold what we occupy, but that's it. The Russian economy is slowing down. The wartime economy is slowing down. Oil revenues still remain about 50% below where they were a year ago. It has just been reconfirmed that India is taking its lowest level of Russian imported oil since late 2022. And that is Russia's second largest customer. China is still limiting purchases below the levels of last year. But as long as we have Russia able to get components, including from China, for its military, as long as they can run a wartime economy and get people to accept cuts in social spending while accepting increases in military spending, and as long as they can find manpower, they'll keep trying to fight. That's just the reality of it. It's a hard message if you're in Ukraine. I hate to say that. I know what you have to endure, but it's a realistic message. I just come back to this. The Europeans make their estimates. The Americans are unpredictable. Fundamental here is Vladimir Putin is fighting for his legacy. So he will not give up easily. But Ukraine is fighting for its existence. So however long we're talking about Russian attacks continuing through 2026, Ukrainian resistance is likely to continue. And so that doesn't mean the talks are unimportant. They're very important, but they're a bit of theater. The reality is support for Ukraine against the Russian invasion. So as well as just talking about the political talks, that means air defenses. That means equipment and weapons for Ukraine on the front line. It means the joint production projects, including the drone production projects that have been launched, and it means supporting Ukraine's counterattacks inside Russia.
Let's also
and it means sanctions.
Let's also cover some interesting statements from also a Munich Security Conference. Zelensky says that he does have more cards because he's younger than Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, Zelensky has proposed a direct meeting between himself and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. What is your assessment of the statements, and what are the chances for such high-level meeting?
No, there's absolutely no chance of the meeting, because the Kremlin's response to that is, oh yeah, we would love to host, President Zelensky in Moscow. Oh, we guarantee his security. Yeah, how reliable are Russian security guarantees? And I think y'all know the answer to that one. So no. And then Zelensky responded, he'd be very happy to meet Mr. Putin at any place outside of Russia. And the Kremlin said, oof, okay, guess not. What I think is interesting about the Zelensky message is he was kind of winding up Vladimir Putin in a very important way. And that is, as well as saying I'm younger and probably better looking than President Putin, he was saying I'm not going away. That's the message. Because we know that the Kremlin wants to get rid of the Zelensky government. We know that it will spread all the propaganda about the government being illegitimate, that they'll be Nazis, that they will continue to push disinformation. They'll try to maneuver the Americans where it's not just a question of Ukraine giving up territory, but that it has to give up its government as well. And Zelensky saying, no, it's not going to happen. Zelensky has said recently, look, as soon as we get a ceasefire, a reliable ceasefire, which is monitored, then we can have elections. And I think those will be very competitive elections. Indeed, I've just noted the interview that General Zelensky, who is likely to be a candidate in those elections, is given to the Associated Press. But until you get a ceasefire, no, you cannot hold those elections, and you cannot expect the Zelensky government just to say, oh, we're going to go on vacation. So it was kind of a bit of theater, but it was kind of necessary theater from Zelensky just to say, look, Kremlin, go ahead and give it this, shout all you want, but we still resist.
Let's also cover Munich Security Conference and U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's speech during this conference. How do you read his message to Europeans? Because they have probably felt sign of a sense of relief after hearing some positive words from Marco Rubio.
I found it really strange because I listened to that Rubio speech, just like the audience did, and just like I'm sure you did, Daniel. And I know that the Europeans said afterwards were kind of relief, but it seemed to be the kind of relief which is, oh, at least he didn't beat us over the head with a big stick like J.D. Vance, the vice president, did a year earlier. In other words, Rubio said nice things about the U.S. and Europe in the past. He talked about the fact that they had a sense of destiny in the past. He talked about how they had been allies in the past. He talked about how the U.S. would want to work together with Europe in the future. But just like Vance a year ago, albeit in a nicer way, he was saying, you have to do this on Donald Trump's terms. In other words, Rubio restated what is in the U.S. national security strategy, which is that the U.S. will support, he didn't call them hard right movements, but that's what he means. They'll support movements who are very much anti-immigration. And those movements include the Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary, who Orban immediately met after Munich and who he, on behalf of the Trump administration, endorsed in Hungary's elections in April. He then met Robert Fico of Slovakia, who is also pro-Kremlin and also hard right. So the fundamental is that the J.D. Vance camp, Rubio was not pushing back against them when they say we want to undermine the European Union. We want to distort these issues of immigration and free speech, as well as issues of security, to break up the European Union and to replace governments. Rubio was continuing that. I mean, I'm going to be very honest with you, and I've used this phrase elsewhere. The Trump administration is supporting white nationalist movements. And it is racially coded white nationalist movements. And even though Marco Rubio is Hispanic, he's a Cuban, he was still carrying that message. And it is a longer-term threat, not just for Ukraine, but for European security, at least in terms of the public rhetoric. The best that we can hope for is that Rubio knew Donald Trump was watching that speech and J.D. Vance were watching that speech, and he didn't want to cross them. We can hope that he did that publicly while privately telling the Europeans, look, whatever I said out there in public, privately, we need to talk about making sure that we actually do have an alliance, which is something that you do not get with Trump and with Vance.
Another interesting debate is going on in Europe, especially after Munich conference. It's about its own European nuclear deterrent. And we heard a lot from European leaders these days that they are citing doubts about long-term U.S. reliability and interesting case with Poland, because its president Karol Nawrocki has announced plans to begin a new development. He did not provide any specific details, so I cannot go further, but it's also interesting to hear your opinion how Moscow actually would react to a European-owned nuclear deterrent and how might it shift Europe's security balance.
When you find out what President Nawrocki said, I'd like to hear that, because remember, this is a person who campaigned for the Polish presidency as a Trumpist. You know, he not like I am an out-and-out Polish version of Donald Trump, but very much working with the type of Trump's messages on immigration, on domestic matters, and indeed skepticism over Ukraine. Now, here we are a few months later, and he is talking about European cooperation, including Ukraine. That's a pretty big shift. And it is part of a wider European shift where Donald Trump has, in a horrible way, helped out. If you cannot rely on the Americans, if you cannot rely on them politically, if you cannot rely on them militarily, if you cannot rely on them economically, you have to become self-sufficient, or at least able to work with other partners. So that includes this 800 billion euro program for defense production and investment, but it also includes, and I didn't think I would see this in my lifetime, discussion of European nuclear capability. The idea is that even if France had the nuclear weapon, which it does, that it would not be completely independent in the way that it used the nuclear weapon. It would coordinate with the United States. The United Kingdom, with its nuclear weapon, coordinate with the United States. Now what we have are France and Germany, albeit there'll be very tough negotiations, but they're talking about how should this European nuclear capability be supervised, be handled, possibly without the United States. And then we see other countries who support that call, like Poland. I don't think we're at the point where we're talking about a European military, the vaunted European Defense Force. What I think we're looking at is, are we going to see a very different NATO? Are we going to see a very different NATO in which, while there may still be an American presence through its military, that far more of the command and oversight structures are in the hands of the Europeans? Look, you have to safeguard yourself from Donald Trump and hope that you can get back to normal if he and J.D. Vance are out of power by January 2029. But until that happens, whether it's nuclear weapons, whether it's conventional weapons, whether it's intelligence sharing, whether it's cybersecurity, you've got to make sure that you have your own capabilities and you don't have to rely on Washington.
Another topic which you already pointed out is about statements from General Zelensky. Indeed, he commented in different topics, and one is widely discussed is, of course, 2023 counteroffensive. He said that it was criticized, and General Valery Zelensky says his NATO-backed plan failed because Ukraine's leadership did not commit enough resources for this counteroffensive, and the strategy was to mass forces in a single force to retake Zaporizhia, the region which hosts Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and to push south to the Sea of Azov to cut Russia's land bridge to Crimea. Indeed, instead, forces spread out and weakening their impact during this counteroffensive. And of course, Western defense officials also confirmed this statement. And from our perspective, it would also interesting to hear your position and what's your take on that, on the statements, and also, do you think that it was the main problem for this counteroffensive?
The first thing I thought when I read General Zelensky's interview with the Associated Press, which is very long, very what we call full and frank, he's running for president. When there is a presidential election, he's running for president, and he wants to distinguish himself from his likely rival, who is the current president, Vladimir Medinsky. So one of the things he would say in that campaign is, I'm the person who oversaw the Ukrainian military, but when it came to 2023, this huge disappointment of the counteroffensive that was supposed to liberate more of the South, more of the East, that's not my fault. That's my opponent's fault, President Zelensky. You know, if we were to go back and talk about this factually, and it is painful for Ukrainians because there was so much hope on that 2023 offensive, you could talk about where resources were placed. You could talk about an over-reliance on tanks, especially in Zaporizhia. You could talk about underestimating the scale of the Russian defenses that had been built up. The fundamental here is, look, there's a phrase in English, success has 1,000 fathers, but failure is an orphan. And nobody wants to say we were part of the failure. But the fact is, Everybody was part of the failure. Yes, Zelensky and his advisors were part of the failure. Yes, the military, including General Zelensky, were part of the failure as well. Because the fundamental, I think, is this, and I'm not a military analyst first and foremost, I'm a political analyst first and foremost. But for my military analyst friends, Ukraine underestimated the role of drones in this war. In 2022, they were able to break through in the south and in the east and do it very rapidly because they caught the Russians by surprise. But the Russians had built up in 2023 with the fortified defenses, and then they had drones. And that caught an offensive which was fought mainly by armor. And that wasn't the way to do it. So I've got to say, I wouldn't play a blame game over 2023. I think everybody bears responsibility for that. But with respect, Sofia, I think the far more interesting part of the Zelensky interview, it goes beyond presidential politics, is his account of the raid on his office in September 2022 during the successful counteroffensive. Zelensky claims that he is meeting with British military at a safe place, because you need a safe place that the Russians won't attack. And then it is raided by the State Security Service, the SBU. He claims that the SBU came in to seize documents, to seize computers, and he told them, get out. He then called Vladimir Zelensky's chief of staff, who is now departed, Andrei Yermak, and effectively said, what are you doing? He then called the head of the SBU, who said, I don't know what's going on. We could talk more about that story, but what's interesting here is there clearly was friction between Zelensky and Zelensky's office and the State Security Service, even as the military was succeeding. And I think it is that question of power at the top that has complicated Ukraine. Now, whether that in part has been resolved because Andrei Yermak has departed, whether he was the rival with Zelensky, or whether, let's put it this way, even though Zelensky talks about that raid in 2022, he is also very careful to say, after I left as commander-in-chief and became ambassador to London, I have had 2 conversations with President Zelensky, and they both were very good conversations. So it doesn't appear that his issue is with Zelensky. His issue is with some of Zelensky's advisors. Now, has that been resolved? And will it be resolved going forward?
Professor Lucas, thank you very much for being with us today and for joining our program. It's always a pleasure to have you with us, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Thank you, Sofia. Thank you, Daniel.
Героям слава, thanks a lot, and see you next week.